For people who are new to this, who are just coming to Red Star Report, you're listening to me, Sue Hirsch of Book Review California on Red Star Report, and with Bettina Aptheker, who wrote Communists in Closets, Queering the History 1930s to 1990s. So thank you for being here with us today. And what can you tell us what of your own experiences drew you to write about this little slice of history so nicely as you did?
Thank you, Sue, very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about Communists in Closets, which was published just a few months ago. And it's been receiving very encouraging endorsements and reviews. And I'm getting also a lot of personal email from people because we're in a category that's sometimes called red diaper babies, which is a funny little expression. But what it means is that we were the children of people who were in or around the Communist Party. And we call ourselves red diaper babies. And I was one of them. And a lot of the people that are writing to me were also raised in such families, or they had uncles or cousins or somebody influential in their lives who were in and around the Communist Party. The Communist Party had a huge membership in the 30s and 40s. So it actually influenced a great deal about American politics. It was not just a little sect. And its cultural magazine, which was called New Masses, had a circulation in the tens of thousands. And all the major writers of the time, from Ernest Hemingway to Langston Hughes to Josephine Herbst to all kinds of folks, that William Carlos Williams, that people would recognize their names because they're part of sort of the iconic literary canon of the United States. A lot of those people wrote for the New Masses. So it had a huge influence beyond people who were actually members of the party. So I was born into a communist family. That's my red diaper heritage. My parents, my mother Fay and my father Herbert Aptheker, were very prominent in the Communist Party. And I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, in the aftermath of World War II. And so you can imagine the period of the end of the Holocaust, and many of the people in our family visits and so forth were survivors of that, or had been in the resistance movements in Europe, as well as in the United States. So that's sort of my background. And I joined the Communist Party. I was sort of raised in it, and I joined it in May of 1962, just before I left to become a student at the University of California in Berkeley. And I left the Communist Party after I was out as a lesbian, publicly out as a lesbian, which I left the party in October of 1981. So I was in the Communist Party for about 19 years. And a lot of things happened during that time, a lot of political activity. It's the height of the civil rights movement. There's lots of, the Angela Davis trial happens. So there's lots of things that are going on. But where I focused this book was on my experiences as being closeted, meaning I was very, very closeted, even though I was married to a man and I had 2 children. And this I discovered as I did the research for this book was not necessarily so uncommon. It was one of the things that queer people did, was they married, including one of the people that I'll talk about a little bit later, because it was a way of being able to be in the Communist Party, because the Communist Party banned gay and lesbians from joining. And it instituted that ban in 1938. And it kept that ban in place until 1991. So that's a 60-year span. And I agree with you. They missed a good bet. They should have let us.
They did.
They should have let us be more open in the Communist Party. So I'll end this response to your question by just saying that it was very meaningful for me to find other people who were like me, who had been in and around the Communist Party, and that they made various choices in terms of how to navigate the ban against them in the Communist Party while at the same time being active in politics.
And what happened for you, Bettina, after you left that party activity? When did you completely finish with that and move on to other things, or what came next in your life?
I never really changed. Well, of course, my political views have evolved. Let's put it that way. But I've always been very much an activist and advocate for social justice and for peace, and for the most possible compassionate response to situations, and to be of the most benefit as I can to as many people as I can. So, I mean, that's sort of been a life project. But what changed for me so dramatically was, so I separated from my husband, who's a very good guy. I always want to emphasize that, is like he's a very decent fellow, and we're still friends, and we had two beautiful children. But I separated from him in 1978,
Mhm.
and we were officially divorced in 1979. And I was moving on in my life. That is correct. You're right in terms of thinking about it. I had two young children, and I was very worried and fearful about coming out or being known as a lesbian, but that's who I was. So I was trying to negotiate that for myself, because I had internalized so much homophobia from all my years in and around the communist left. It was very, very homophobic. They declared us, as I said, degenerates. They said horrible things about us, in terms of some of the worst bigotry that you'll find even in right-wing sources. They repeated. I do want to say that their official reason for banning communists, that started reinstituted in the 1950s, was that they said that communists could people who were in the Communist Party who were gay might be approached by Soviet agents, to become spies against the United States. And so we were not to be members of the Communist Party, and excuse me, not to be, yeah. And the other side of that is that the government of the United States and the State Department and so forth fired thousands of LGBT people. The same time that there was all this anti-communist stuff going on, they were firing LGBT people, calling them before committees and so forth, because for the same reason, they said that they could become Soviet spies, and the party was saying that the FBI could get their hooks in us, and we would become informants for the FBI against the Communist Party. So both sides were saying the same thing from opposite ends of the political spectrum, and it was so unfortunate and so unnecessary.
Right,
And
right.
none of the people that surfaced in the various trials against communists and so forth were gay or lesbian. In all the trials and all the hundreds of trials that were held, no one was. So there was one person who was, but she joined the Communist Party as an FBI agent. She wasn't being blackmailed. She did it voluntarily. And that's only one person. And so the whole thing was just completely unnecessary. But in response, then, adding to your question, so I fell in love with a woman. I'm still with her. It's over 40 years. Her name is Kate Miller. She was born and raised in North Dakota, of all places, and came from a very conservative family. They were Republicans. Her parents were members of the Lutheran Church, just sort of the opposite of how I was raised. And a woman of marvelous intellect and politically courageous. So after she left North Dakota, she became very active in all kinds of movements for social justice also. And in any event, and she had been also married and with a child, and so we had three children between us. Well, I
Mm.
fell in love with her, and you're soaring with happiness, and it all feels absolutely wonderful. But it became clear that I couldn't maintain my membership in the Communist Party and be in this kind of relationship, and so I left.
Mm.
And and that felt very good at the time. It felt very compatible. I was worried about it, and I was very um, anxious about it. I was anxious about how my parents would respond, but nevertheless, it felt right in terms of internally how I was feeling.
How did they respond? How did your parents respond?
Well, my mother was marvelous. And I think I tell a little bit of that in the book. When I came out to my mother, she told me she'd known since I was 16. And then I said, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And she said, "Because she hoped for the best." And from her
Right,
point of view, you see, the best was that I would marry and have children and lead a conventional life, from a personally conventional life, even if I was a communist, which wasn't too conventional. So my mother, after I came out to her and she said that, she also told me about this social worker, and founder of a settlement house on the Lower East Side in New York, that was called the Henry Street Settlement, where she used to go as a kid. It was a very important center for immigrant families, poverty-stricken immigrant families. And the head of that was a woman named Lillian Wald, who was very famous actually in these circles, and she was a lesbian. And my mother and I had just found that out when I was having this conversation with my mother. I had just found out that Lillian Wald was a lesbian from some historian's research that she was doing. And so I asked my mother, "Well, how did you know? How'd you know this?" And my mother sort of went, "Oh, the whole neighborhood knew."
that's funny.
So these crazy things that happened. So my mom was great. She really liked Kate very, very much. And she said, "I'll take care of your father." That's what she said to me. And I assumed what that meant was that she would talk with him about it. And and he was very good about welcoming Kate into the family also. He was very upset when I left the Communist Party. That was a big upset for him.
Mhm.
We argued about it, and it was my mother again who intervened and said, "Enough." To my father, she said, "Enough." Uh,
Right.
you know. And then the other thing I'll just share about this is that over the years, my father would occasionally tell me to look up a particular person. He would say, "You should check out Maud Russell, or you should check out Bertha Reynolds." He would things like that. He would say to me. He never used the word lesbian. He never intimated anything like that. But when I was doing this research, I started checking out those people, and he was right. They
Mm.
were, and I don't know how he knew. And he's no longer living, and I can't ask him. But it was pretty remarkable. So I think I was very fortunate. I was very, very fortunate with my parents' response, and I was also very fortunate with my husband's response, the man who had been my husband, because although he was very upset and very, he was very hurt. His feelings were very hurt. He was very upset and angry. I think he was quite angry. I think we both were. But the point about it is he never tried to take custody of the children from me, which many men did. And he never did. He believed in civil rights for gay and lesbian people, and he still does. So I was a very fortunate person in these circumstances.
Anyway, I want to go back to your book and ask you what was your most memorable introduction to the Communist Party as an LGBTQ person? Your first experience of meeting up with that conflict of being LGBTQ and wanting to be in the Communist Party and they're trying to block you.
For me, it was a little bit different because I was so closeted. And so you need to understand, I think people need to understand, because of the family in which I was raised also, we were under constant FBI surveillance from my childhood. The FBI was always a presence.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, our phone was tapped. And when I came to Berkeley, when I had just started at Berkeley, I was 18 years old. I was followed by an FBI agent who introduced himself to me. His name was Donald Jones, and he followed me everywhere. He was very upfront about it. I was not doing anything illegal. Everything I did was public and, above board. But so I was under constant FBI surveillance. And then I was hiding my sexuality also from my husband, because I was quite aware of my situation. and I was hiding from the party. So I had these multiple places where I was trying to hide. And so you think you're in the closet, and I think for many LGBT people, we've all experienced this. You think you're in the closet, but actually the closet is much more transparent than you realize that it is. So as a consequence of this, I had some very difficult experiences, both from police and FBI and during imprisonment from my participation in the free speech movement, which was civil rights actions, and in Berkeley in the 60s. And so that's how I would respond to what you're saying, or the question that you were asking. So that shapes a lot about your personality and your feelings. And I wasn't alone in this. I think that there were many other people who were queer, who were in and around the Communist Party, who were also under surveillance, and who also made, certainly one of the people I talk about is Lorraine Hansberry, a little bit later in the book, was a famous playwright. And, was certainly under surveillance. So was Harry Hay, who's another person I talk about. And we all handled it in various ways, but none of us ever became informers.
If you could be asked any question about that chapter of your life right now, what would that question be?
I think the main thing is when you're active in the communist left, as I was for so many years, it's foundational. So it's foundational to who you are and how you think about things and how you register things. But it's also and it was foundational for many of the people I talk about in my book. But you don't stay static either. So you come to recognize the terrible crimes committed, for example, in the former Soviet Union under the Stalin period, which started actually even before. And you come to see that in terms of the homophobia, that the Soviet Communist Party also banned gays and lesbians and was very, very homophobic under Stalin. And that transmitted itself to other communist parties in the rest of the world. But then depending on the cultural circumstances, so the French and Italian tended to be more open, even though they didn't allow membership, but they were more open about it. Whereas in the American Communist Party, it was much more rigid in its attitudes. Mm-hmm. So from a personal point of view, I still think about things. But I was, for example, I was in 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. And some people may remember that. There was a pro-democracy movement in Czechoslovakia, and there was a great effort on the part of the Dubček government, whose name was Dubček, to change the character of socialism. And it failed because of a Soviet invasion. And I was very, very opposed to that. And I spoke out against it in Communist Party meetings, and there were a few other people that did as well. And some of those people who spoke out against it were expelled. I was very upset about that. There were some wonderful people who had been in the Communist Party, and because of their opposition, I thought about leaving the party at that time, but I didn't. And part of this has to do with being raised in the family that I was, and trying to stay loyal to my parents, and at the same time that I was coming into my own as a person. So that really changed a lot of things for me. I would love to talk about some of the people that I found and how I did the research for the book, if that's okay with you. Because everybody was so closeted, it was very challenging to find people. And the research for this book took about 10 years in the archives. And that was it was both exhilarating, but also challenging. So the Communist Party archives are at a library at New York University called the Tamament Library. And I was there for many, many months, over years. I would have a sabbatical, or I was not teaching for a period of time, or something like that, and I could go and I could do this research. And then I was told that I could access everything, all the files, everything like that. They're all in folders, in boxes and folders, but I wasn't allowed to look at the files of what was called the Control Commission, or sometimes called the Review Commission. And that commission of the Communist Party was the place where people had disciplinary action taken against them, or there were cases where there was some question about their membership in the party. And of course, those are the files I most needed to see. So I called the Communist Party. I spoke with the then General Secretary. I had lunch with him. His name at that time was Sam Webb. And he was very open to my being able to see anything I wanted to see. So those files were open to me. And I was the first person outside of the inner circle of the Communist Party to see them. And I read them. And the way the files are organized, you have to look at every folder. There were thousands of folders, but you have to look at every one, because it's just a name or a date or something like that. So you don't know what's in it. You don't know who the person is or anything. And the only condition that was placed upon me, which I accepted, was that I wouldn't name anybody. I wasn't going to name anybody, that I would treat it more like a sociological study, X number of people or so forth. And that was fine with me. I wasn't trying to, in those files, I wasn't trying to cause harm to anybody or anything like that. But it was very revealing. And it was in those papers that I actually saw the extent of the homophobia. And I also saw that there were many people who wrote letters to the Communist Party in this time period, especially in the 60s and the 70s, in which they asked the Communist Party to change its attitude toward gay and lesbian people. A lot of the people that wrote in were not gay and they would say, "I'm not a lesbian," or "I'm not queer," but please change this policy. And most of the time, the party never even bothered to respond. There was no response. So this, again, was very revealing of the level of homophobia and the refusal to engage. So that's a little bit about how I did the research. And then once I had individual people that I wanted to look at, like, for example, Harry Hay, which I can talk about Harry in just a couple of minutes, I would go to where his archive was. And most of Harry Hay's papers are in the San Francisco Public Library. And I spent a long time there. I also listened to his oral history, which was done by another historian whose name is John D'Amelio. And that was in the New York Public Library. So you can see that I had to travel to different places in order to do this research. Another person I researched was a women's historian whose name was Eleanor Flexner. And her papers were at the Schlesinger Library of Women's History at Radcliffe, Harvard. So I was there for quite a while. And then another person I researched was a woman named Betty Millard. And her papers are at Smith College, which is in Northampton, Massachusetts. So you can see that I moved around the country, not everywhere, but many places over this 10-year period. And that's how I did research for the book. And it was very validating for me personally to see, oh, yes, I understand this person, or I see why they did what they did, or I appreciate the contribution that they made.
That must have been really kind of exciting to read those letters. I remember one time my husband and son and I went into a museum somewhere where there were old postcards, and they were there because of the old postage stamps. And I wasn't really supposed to be reading the postcard, what people had written, to their loved ones on these postcards, but I found that to be way more exciting than the postage stamps.
Yeah.
The postage stamps don't tell you much about real people and how they lived in
Yeah.
the time that the postage stamp was made. It's just a little picture that, somebody liked enough to put on a postage stamp.
Right, right, yeah. So, in this case, for example, so Betty Millard was a communist activist, and she was born into a fairly wealthy family in Chicago, on the outskirts of Chicago. And she declared herself a communist when she was 15 years old because she liked girls. She was attracted to girls at the age of 15. And of course, that was a little bit of hyperbole, but she actually got thrust out of the conservative wealth of that family, the wealth and the conservative politics of that family, although she had a lot of affection for her mother and her grandmother and so on. But she changed her views because she felt as an outcast, you see, because she was attracted to women and girls. And everybody said to her, "Oh, you'll outgrow it," and so forth, like it was teenage crushes and stuff, but she never outgrew it. And she became an editor at that journal called New Masses that I was mentioning before when we first started talking, and she was like an assistant editor there, and she was definitely queer. There was no question about it in her mind who she was, and she wrote a pamphlet. Actually, it was two articles that were published in the New Masses in 1948, that is called Woman as Myth. And it's really a very early feminist analysis of the oppression of women. And it was done from a sort of Marxist and feminist perspective. It's a very powerful. And it's written before those people that may know Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex, which is a very famous book that wasn't translated in the United States until the early 50s into English. It was published in France. And long before Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which was another 10 years later. So it's a very, very early. And I think it reflected her understanding of women as an oppressed group of people, because she understood herself in terms of her own ability to do things, to edit, to write, and so on. And then later, after that, so the pamphlet was published then as a pamphlet and became very influential. She even talked about violence against women, about rape of women, which was unheard of at that time. Now it's very common. We talk about sexual violence against women, but at that time, 1948, nobody was talking about that, and certainly not in any kind of public way.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, because we as a society still oppress women and LGBTQ people and Black people. It's kind of the American lifestyle to oppress others, or the others, I like to call it. Just anyone who is not of your subgroup of Americans. And we do that, I think, in order to make ourselves feel superior. And that has to come from a place of insecurity within ourselves. You're putting somebody else down in order to make yourself feel superior. And school bullies do that, and politicians do it, and religion does it. Religion is another, really powerful vehicle of oppression.
Well, what you're saying is not untrue, but they're very complicated questions. Because, for example, religion, depending on the religious tradition, they can also be very liberating. For example, during the civil rights movement in the South, for African American people, I'm talking about the 60s, the church was the central place for organizing to oppose segregation. And people came to church, and there was the singing, and there was the sense of solidarity, and there was a sense of claiming the righteousness of the Lord. So there's a social justice theme that also runs through religious traditions. It just depends on on what you claim. What's claimed in the Jewish tradition, which I'm part of. We have something called tikkun, Tikkun, the Hebrew word, which means to heal the world. So, but you can also have very, very conservative tradition within Judaism that does what you say, as you can in Christianity, where it can be very racist or anti-Semitic. So again, I just think we see it's complicated in terms of how people. But in this country, I think one of the things we have to recognize in terms of structures of oppression, which is what you're really getting at, you're sort of looking at the psychology of it, which is very, very valid. But there's also a political and economic structure, which includes, of course, enslavement and conquering Native American peoples and colonial wars. And so we have a very complex history in our country. And we also have resistance to those things, which gives us a wonderful heritage of social justice and courage. So you have both things at the same time. And the LGBT people that I was looking at, I think, had tremendous courage a good part of the time. One of the things I was going to say about Betty Millard, I'm just going to circle back to this for a minute because it was apropos of something you said earlier. She had a very severe nervous breakdown in after the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. So you see, that's some years for the same reason. There was a pro-democracy movement in Hungary, and then the Soviet tanks came in, and she had been in Europe in the late 1940s, and had seen the rise of socialism, which she believed in, and had seen women being liberated in many beautiful ways in terms of being able to be educated and employed and literacy and all kinds of things that for her were very, very important for all of us. And so I had access to her diaries. She kept journals while she was having this breakdown. And it's in the book because I had permission from her niece, who's was her literary executor, to use them. And very kind of Olivia Millard to allow me to use them. But they're very revealing I mean, I could so identify with them when the structure of your world, what you think is true, the structure collapses under you, and you see that what you thought was true is not true, and the structure unravels. And that's true for everybody. In other words, no matter what your structure is, whether it's religious or a political, or it doesn't matter, cultural, if the structure unravels, it's very difficult to maintain your balance, your equanimity, your sanity. And she did. I mean, she ultimately did. And she had a fabulous life. And she lived to the age of 98. So she was born in the very beginning, in I think 1911 was when she was born, and she died in 2010, something like that. And so she lived long enough for the flowering of the LGBT movement, you see. She lived long enough to experience that. And the younger lesbians just adored her. And that was a wonderful thing for her. So she really was able to see herself very differently later in her life. But she was a journalist, an activist, a writer. She edited something called Latin America Today for many years. So she was a quite charismatic leader.
Wonderful. I'm glad you had a chance to present her to us a little bit. That's really great. It's a good name to know. Say her name one more time for us.
Yes. Betty Millard, Millard. Betty Millard.
Got it.
Yeah.
And
so there's a whole chapter on her in the book, you see. So I just gave you a little snippet.
Exactly. And I like that your book is almost it's really chronologically organized. And it's, like I said, a little slice of life from that era when we were so oppressive toward the LGBTQ community.
But one thing I wanted to mention was that one of my gay communists was a man named Harry Hay, who founded the first gay rights organization in the United States. It was called the Mattachine Society in 1951, which was a heck of a time to try to develop a gay rights organization. But the thing I wanted to say was Harry Hay lived for quite a long time in just on the outskirts of El Pueblo in New Mexico, and was very good friends with a white woman who was an anthropologist whose name was Sue Ellen Jacobs, who was a cultural anthropologist who was also tied in with the indigenous people, spoke Tewa, which was the language of the people in that area. And the importance of it was that Harry discovered that among Native American peoples, there was not the same kind of attitude or discrimination or hostility toward gay people. They were called two-spirit. And he wrote about it. And he was very interested in this because instead of discrimination, he found that there was also honoring of somebody who would be balanced the way they were seeing it, male, female, you see, embodied in one person, with a kind of what we in the Anglo world we might call androgynous, but that was a very spiritual gift. And so he wrote about that and was it influenced a great deal, especially later in his life when he founded a group called Radical Fairies, which is a funny name. So in that sense, the Native American traditions, at least some of those Native American traditions, had a very, very positive effect for gay and lesbian people. And there's another man named, he's not a communist, but a scholar whose name is Will Roscoe, who lives in San Francisco. And Will wrote an important book about Two-Spirit people also.
Are you still doing some activism?
Well, yes, I'm still involved in various things. You asked before in terms of myself. After I came out, I had gone back to university and became a professor here at University of California, Santa Cruz, which was a great place for me to land. And so I became very much of what we call a scholar activist. So working with the students, both graduate and undergraduate, and activities that they're involved in, working with the LGBT community here, but also many, many anti-racist struggles, some of which are, of course, very much alive and well, I must say, now with some of the politics that are going on with condemning critical race theory and so forth. So I was very instrumental in helping to build both feminist studies, also critical race and ethnic studies here on the campus, which I helped. I was very much an ally in that movement and so forth. So that's been my life experience, has been to combine the scholarship and the activism.
This is your book review of Communists in Closets, Queering the History, 1930s to 1990s. And I wanted to say it again for everybody. And it's written by Bettina Aptheker. And you can get it where, Bettina? Where can we all get your book?
Well, the easiest thing to do, it's available on all of the major booksellers online. So it's on Amazon, for example. Goodreads is another example. You can get it directly from the publisher, Routledge. Any bookstore will order it for you, but not all bookstores will carry it. And one of the reasons for that is, which is just sort of nothing I can control, is that the Routledge, which is a good publisher, but they price their books very high. So the book even the paperback is rather expensive. And so a lot of the bookstores don't want to carry it because it's just hard. But you can get it on, all you have to do is Google me or Google the title of the book, and it'll come up and you'll get the websites, and you can easily order the book. Amazon comes in 2 days. I mean, it's very fast. So it's very easy to order it that way. And I'll also say, it's not out yet, but I know that an audio book is in production and will be out very soon. And I know some people really like to listen to books on tape, and you'll be able to do that with this book as well. So watch out for that. You'll see it eventually. It'll come up on, of course, Amazon and the Routledge site and so forth.
And if you could have a moment to put out one last message in a nutshell to our listeners, what would that message be from your book?
The message I would give to people is follow your heart. Follow your heart. So when you see something that bothers you, that's an injustice, see what you can do to help. Even if it seems like a very minor thing, don't be discouraged by that. Sometimes the forces of government or oppression, whether it's racialized oppression or homophobic oppression, can seem very large, very overwhelming. But if we each take just a little piece and do a little bit of what we can do, that's the start, and it makes you feel good. It makes your heart feel good. It gives you a warmth and a feeling like you're a human being and you can make a difference, even if it's for one person at a time. And I think that's the message I would impart, and that's the thing that I really saw in the people whose lives I was fortunate enough to write about in this book. They had many difficulties, but they didn't necessarily overcome all of those difficulties, but they kept an open heart, and they did the best they could, and they did some amazing work, and they really helped people. So they helped found women's history as a field. They helped found gay civil rights as an action. They helped social justice in Latin America. They campaigned against fascism, and all of these things that really were very, very wonderful things to do with a life. And you have one life, one precious human life, and to give as much as you can to be of benefit to others, I think is a beautiful thing.
And you did a lot in your life, and then you wrote about it in this book here, folks. Type it into your search engine. It's called Communists in Closets, Queering the History 1930s through 1990s. You got to go get this book. It's written by Miss Bettina Aptheker. And you've been here with me listening to all of it on RSR's own Book Review California with Sue Hirsch and Bettina Aptheker. Thank you so much again, people. Everybody have a wonderful day.